Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be doing the Place and Time book tag. This is a tag that was created quite a while ago by Jen Campbell, but it was recently tagged by Charlotte, whose channel I will leave linked down below in the description for you to check out. I highly recommend you checking out her videos. When I stumbled across her channel, I was just like, yes, this person is for me. So I think if you like this channel, you will really like her channel as well. This is a pretty self-explanatory tag that is really similar to an idea that I've had floating around in my head for a while, but I've not known the best format for it to take, and turns out there's a tag, so that's perfect. It's just about discussing books that you associate with a particular time and place in your life. I'm actually going to be doing two parts to this video, so in this one I'm going to be talking about fiction and poetry, and in part two I'm going to be talking about non-fiction. Because when I started pulling books off my shelf, there were just like a lot that I wanted to talk about. I think this is really interesting because across both sets of books, most of them are books that I associate with a really liminal space, whether that's a literal liminal space or a symbolic liminal space, so those kind of in-between stages. A lot of them are books that I associate with a time where there was a lot of change in my life, or a lot of them were books that I was literally reading in between places. So on transport, in airports, those kinds of things. And I think when you're in those very literal liminal spaces, it gives a real opportunity for those books to really connect with you. I don't know why that is. This first book is one that I read a long time ago, and I did read it in quite a liminal space. I read it in a hotel room, and this is Love Lessons by Jacqueline Wilson. I have lost the dust jacket from this one. So I very vividly remember reading this at a cousin's wedding. You don't need my whole family history, but basically my dad's side of the family is like a huge stereotypical Irish family, like there's fucking loads of us. So I have a lot of cousins that are like significantly older than me, so I went to like a lot of weddings when I was quite young, and I think I must have been maybe like 10 or 11 when I read this book. I used to do this all the time at family occasions where I would be like unwell when I just didn't want to be around people, which is really strange because I'm totally like the opposite of that now. Like I always want to be around people now, but when I was growing up I just always wanted to be on my own. My therapist will have fun with that one, but I just remember like sneaking up to the hotel room and sitting and reading this book and remembering like it being so scandalous to me. I think in the first chapter she's talking about picking out nice like underwear, and the rest of the book is about her like feelings for her art teacher and her babysitting for his kids, but like I don't remember how far it goes, but he not good. He was not good. But I just remember reading it at the time and thinking it was like, oh my god, this is so scandalous. Should I be reading this? I feel like I really want to reread this. I really want to reread a lot of Jacqueline Wilson books actually. I feel like the most sensible order for me to talk about these books in is the order I read them in. So the next one I'm going to talk about is The Magicians by Lev Grossman. This is a fantasy book, which isn't something that I always love, but I have such a significant connection to this book. I first read this on a really long coach journey to Disneyland Paris. Like literally I just sat and read the whole thing on one coach journey. This is about a boy who's about to go off to college, but then he is whisked away to this like magical college. And what I really loved about this book was it really deconstructed some of the romanticized reasoning for why we want to so desperately go to magical places, magical schools, when they are actually really dangerous. And another thing that I really loved about this book was it kind of allegorically worked for thinking that you will be happy as soon as you have the next thing. Like as soon as I get into this university, as soon as I get this job, as soon as I get this, live in this place, then I will be happy. Like it really deconstructed that idea as well, and I read this just before I went to university, so that was kind of something that was mulling around in my head. This is definitely not a perfect book, and there are definitely issues with it, and the main character is very annoying, but I will just always have a very personal connection to this book. I think that's another thing that really gives you a connection to something, is if you just like devour it in one sitting, you'll always feel quite close to it, I think. Moving on to a few books that I read at university, the first one I'm going to talk about is Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, although I specifically want to talk about The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a long form poem, and it's where the idea of like having an albatross around your neck comes from, like something that's really weighing you down. This was the first thing I ever read at university, and it's I think kind of a bit of a running joke with any anyone that studied English lit at Aberystwyth. I feel like it's kind of our initiation. And I always remember whenever we had like white t-shirt socials or something during Freshers Week, there would always be like loads of jokes about this poem on people's t-shirts. I just want to emphasize I said white t-shirt social, not wet t-shirt social. People always confuse the two. I'm also going to leave a song in the description which really reminds me of this poem. The next book I want to talk about is The Reluctant Fundamentalist by Mohsin Hamid. I read this in a contemporary literature module and I just remember being blown away by it. It was just like nothing I'd ever read before. Side note, if you would be interested in me doing a video about all of the books that I read at university, do leave me a comment down below and let me know. It's something that might require a little bit of planning, but I think it would be really interesting. The structure of this book is really interesting in that it's just one conversation, it's just one stream of speech. The setting of this book is a Lahore cafe where a Pakistani man sits down with an American, they don't know each other, and the Pakistani man just starts speaking and telling his story. I found it really fascinating how it might seem like this book is told in the second person because it's addressed to you, but actually the whole book is just one piece of dialogue. This was another one of those books that I sat down and read in one sitting. I just found it so fascinating. I loved thinking about what an unreliable narrator we had here, what assumptions I was bringing to the text, and also the ending of this book blew me away. The ending of this book really leads you to confront your own preconceptions about people, your own prejudices, and I so vividly remember being sat in my really shitty flat that I had in my first year of university and just being so captivated by this book. And the final book I'm going to talk about from university was Trumpet by Jackie Kay. This one I read in my second year of university, but I had very much a similar experience as I did with The Reluctant Fundamentalist in that I so vividly remember being sat in that same flat and just devouring this book in one sitting and just being so... I just remember feeling like it was such an incredible book. Like I just remember that feeling so viscerally. This book follows the aftermath of the death of Joss Moody, who was a famous jazz musician. After Joss's death, it is discovered that Joss had female genitalia, but Joss lived their life as a man. I always find it really difficult to talk about this book because I think it's a simplification to say Joss was a man because you never actually find out from Joss. Everything we know about Joss is told from other people. We never actually hear Joss speak for themselves and say how they identified. So both of these books I think I had very similar experiences with in that they really challenged how I thought about the world and how I thought about literature. Study at Aberystwyth University, kids. Next I have a poetry pamphlet, and that is Teaching My Mother How to Give Birth by Warsan Shire. This is another book that I really associate with the liminal space. This is another one that I read while I was in a hotel room. So I read this just before my third year of university. Without going into my life story too much, I had a really massive breakup between my second year of university and my third year of university, and I really frantically quickly had to move out of the house that we shared. And for a while I was just kind of bouncing around people's spare rooms, storing my stuff in a friend's house, and I can't remember the exact details of it, but there was like one night where I didn't have anywhere to stay. And I really vividly remember reading this collection while I was in the hotel room that I was staying in for that one night. I found this a really empowering reading experience. If you can't quite place where you know the name Warsan Shire from, some of her poetry has been sampled in Beyonce songs, and yeah, it was a situation where I very easily could have felt kind of like down about myself and about my life, but I had this really empowering piece of literature, so I just did it. In fact, it turned a situation that I could have, you know, felt negatively about to making me realise that it was a situation where I was really taking charge of and getting my shit together. Anyway, oversharing time's done. On a bit of a more light-hearted note, this is One Day in December by Josie Silver. I think the books that you read around Christmas time really lend themselves to that as well, but I do feel like Christmas is also kind of that liminal space, especially if you know, don't live near your family and you find yourself coming back for a week or two. But I did also read this in one of the most liminal spaces there is. I read this in an airport and then on the flight. This is just like a really cheesy-ish love story. It's about two people who see each other through the window pane on a bus, and they just feel like this instant connection to one another, and the girl thinks about getting off the bus but then she doesn't, and then this bus boy has just become like a kind of running joke between her and her best friend that this guy is actually her soulmate. And then one day her best best friend brings this guy home not knowing he's the same busboy. This book is swoony, it's morally complex at points. Ultimately, at the heart of the story, there's the friendship between these two girls. This was the book that made me realize that, yeah, I'm actually into rom-coms. I think I'd been really reluctant to say I was into them for a long time because of some internalized misogyny. But this was the book that really changed that for me, and I always really associate that Christmas with this book. And now, whenever I'm traveling home for Christmas, although I may just be here for Christmas every year, I always try to pick a similar rom-com-ish book to kind of pay homage to the reading experience I had with this one. Next, I have Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. I think this book is kind of perfect for this tag in some ways, because I think if I read this book at any other time other than the time I did read it, I would not think about it so fondly, I would not have such a connection to this novel. And we're back to me talking about my breakups. If you want to know more about my breakup books and what books I think are good for breakups, I will leave a video linked down below in the description that I did all about breakup books. Trust me, there's going to be a few more in the non-fiction part of this tag. To give a very reductive overview of this book, in Sense and Sensibility we follow the Dashwood sisters Eleanor and Marianne and the various trials and tribulations in their life that have a lot of social commentary like you would expect from a Jane Austen novel. But what I found particularly interesting about this one was their romantic relationships and their contrasting ways of dealing with heartbreak. I did not expect to feel such a connection to one of the Dashwood sisters, and if you'd asked me a few years ago, like, do you think you'd be like Eleanor, or do you think you'd be like Marianne, I'd be like, yeah, I'm like an Eleanor. No, I am not. I am so Marianne. Marianne is like quite often kind of annoying. She really struggles to not make situations about herself, which is something that I also struggle with. But also when she gets her heart broken, she just like locks herself in her room for days and just sobs and is really melodramatic, and it just made me think, do you know what, if this shit has been happening since whenever the fuck Jane Austen was writing, I don't know, when did this come out? First published in 1811. If people were getting their heart broken in 1811 and sobbing in their room, if they could all get through it, so could I. And I think it's testament to one of the reasons that a lot of classic novels have this enduring appeal. You know, my situation wasn't the exact same as Marianne's, but I definitely found a profound connection to how we were dealing with it. But of course, in saying all that, I don't think I would have got that from it if I hadn't read it when I did. Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. It's just a really fantastic book about a girl named Queenie who's dealing with a breakup, is doing a lot of like self-destructive behaviors when it comes to like who she's sleeping with. She's not taking care of her mental health, and there were just so many things that I really connected to in this book. This book deals with miscarriage, which is something that I always really appreciate seeing, giving attention and focus to in books. I think it's something we as people with wombs don't really speak about enough. I really connected to Queenie not really taking care of herself and putting herself in like unsafe situations. But the reason I really associate this book with a time and a place is because Queenie spends much of this novel house hunting. And I read this book when I was house hunting in London, and we had like the same budget and we're looking in the same parts of London as well. So when she was talking about all the various awful flats that she went to see, I was like, I feel you. I feel you so much. So I kind of associate this with being like my moving to London book. Again, a really like liminal space in my life. And the final book I'm going to talk about in this part of the video is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. I think the books that we're reading at this time are going to be really interesting to look back on. I wonder if in a few years we'll look back on this time and have like our pandemic books, you know, the books that we really associated with this strange time in all of our lives. And I think this book is definitely one that I will look back on in that way. This book is set in both the 1970s and 1815, and it follows an aspiring writer named Dana who is transported back to 1815 where she is assumed to be a slave. And gradually Dana figures out that the reason she has been transported back there is to protect a white boy. This white boy is actually one of her ancestors, so she has to keep him safe and protect him, even though like he is the son of a slave owner and grows up to be a slave owner himself and does horrible things to black people. Dana has to like make sure he's safe, otherwise she would have never existed. Not only is this book just profoundly fantastic and I would recommend it to everyone, but it really pulled me out of a personal reading slump. I think throughout this strange time of lockdown, of the pandemic, of quarantine, whatever you want to call it, we've all had a strange relationship with our reading. I know at least I have anyway, and I've definitely had some of the worst reading slumps goosebumps I've ever had throughout this past like 6 months. And this is the book that really pulled me out of what was probably the worst of those, because it was just so truly fantastic. So that's it. They are all of the books that I'm going to talk about in this video. Do leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of them, or if you connect different books to similar experiences that I've spoken about. All of the books that I've spoken about will be linked down below in the description, and they are links to Blackwell's, not the Book Depository. Blackwell's is a chain of independent bookshops in the UK, so if you want to find out more about these books, they will be linked down below. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you in my next video.